Logan Chair at Roosevelt University. A native Chicagoan, Dr. Reed has matched scholarly interest and civic commitment with nativity. Returning to the university in 1987 as associate professor, he has served as well as director of the St. Clair Drake Center for African and African American Studies. His scholarship includes All the World is Here, the Black Presence at White City, the Chicago NAACP, and the Rise of the Black Professional Leadership, 1910 to 1966. His latest endeavor, Black Chicago's First Century, 1833 to 1933, will be coming out at the end of this year. Major works in progress include the barbershop, a multifaceted African American institution, and the West Side of Chicago, African American life outside the Black metropolis. Is he heavy?
Yes, he is. Yes, he is.
It is with great honor and pleasure that I introduce to you a long friend of mine, Dr. Christopher Reed.
It's an honor and a pleasure to be here this afternoon. That is the most appropriate opening. You know, for years, I was telling this lady, I was known as the fellow around Roosevelt University who walked around with the photograph of an ancestor, my great-grandfather, who got his freedom by fighting in the Civil War. We call him the Liberator. His unit, the 116th Colored Infantry out of Kentucky, was made up entirely of former slaves. And the 116th was there at Appomattox when Robert E. Lee surrendered. Now, I've been at Appomattox. I don't know what Lee would have said at that time. I imagine it was something like, the gig is up. You see, he looked out. I stood where Lee stood after he walked out the courthouse after the surrender. And across the battlefield, about 1,000 yards away, were tens of thousands of Union troops. But in the middle of the battle formation were 3 black regiments, 31st from New York, Navy slaves who didn't even know what New York was, but they fought for that state, you know, to meet the quota. Next, the 29th Illinois, representing Illinois and Chicago, but most of those men had never heard of Chicago, had never been to Chicago. They were recruited into the ranks of the 29th to fill its enlistment quota. And then next was the 116th, my great-grandfather's unit. And that's interesting, as I asked retired Colonel Eugene Scott, who used to run the defendant. Colonel used to command a tank battalion over in Europe. I said, Colonel Scott, what's the significance of these 3 regiments in the middle of the battle formation? He said, you don't put any weak units in the middle of the battle formation. They were there for a purpose. Now, they had marched 96 miles in 3 days. It was a hard march because they knew if they could keep Lee on the run, his so-called invincible army of Northern Virginia would be forced to just give up and say in unison by the thousands, the gig's up, great Mooga Mooga. They beat us. Anyway, I don't know if he said great Mooga Mooga, but it's great to know who was there as a liberator. So that's sort of, in terms of ancestry, all my life I've heard about Grandpa slaughter. This is something I did after this is interesting. This is not what I'm here to talk about, but after the family gathering in Pattonville, Texas 2 years ago, which is next door to Paris, Texas. I want to make a comment about Paris in a minute. Well, we were there to celebrate the 65th wedding anniversary of my uncle, who was the grandson of Henry and Josephine Slaughter. And I put this together after the function just so that the young people could actually see photographs of their ancestors, starting with the liberator and his wife. I said, that's our starting point. Self-liberation. Yeah. A word about, and I'm gonna get into the Great Migration, a word about Pattonville, which is next door to Paris, Texas. I think, Sherry, I think I told you about my uncle voting. Yeah, and I said, Uncle John, have you voted? This is for the presidential election. He said, yeah, we got out there early and voted. We didn't want to run into the necks on election day. You see, Pattonville is the place that these people fled from in 1920. They came after the Great Migration. They fled after two sons were lynched. There was a big dispute over land. That's usually why you had most of the lynching. It was over economics. That's why people were lynched. If you dared challenge those in authority over who owned the land, how much you got of the distribution of crops, you talked back and said, oh, no, that should be 8 instead of 6, you were in trouble. So this family, the Arthur family, and there's still relatives around in Chicago, saw 2 of their sons lynched, and then 2 of these daughters were raped in the basement of the police station in Paris, Texas. And as soon as they could, the family fled Paris, Texas in 1920 and came to Chicago, where they were greeted by black people. And this is part of the story then of what I want to talk about, the Great Migration, how people were greeted when they got here. But this is a fascinating story. Now, Vernon Jarrett deserves some of the credit for pulling out the story, as does Darlene Blanton of Atlanta, Georgia, who writes for the Tribune, and the Arthur family. They don't talk about what happened, and I sure wouldn't want to talk about it after the tragedy that sent them up here. They're doing well now. But I'm here today to talk about what people brought to Chicago during the Great Migration. Now, technically, the Great Migration is dated from 1916 to 1918. Although people arrived before 1916, and of course, as you saw from the photograph of the Arthurs, they were coming in the 1920s. My wife's folks were coming in the 1940s, and I know people that got here in the 1950s. College graduates from the historic black colleges are still coming up, so the migration has been constant. We were talking about Carter G. Woodson. Carter G. Woodson documented this in his famous book, A Century of Negro Migration. There's been a constant migration around the country, a constant migration to Chicago. I documented part of that migration in the first volume of 3 volumes on Black Chicago. And I'm going to put this here only because I don't like bragging, because where I come from, over west, we know how to be humble. We leave the bragging to Southside. Why do you live west? It allows me to travel east. Anyway, the migration was constant. And one of the things you noticed about the migrants throughout the years was that they brought with them some very interesting baggage. One of the things they brought was money. For some reason, somebody thinks people that arrived during the period of the Great Migration came up penniless. Some did. Some had their money stolen on the way up. That's how they got to be penniless. Some left with some money, but if you were getting on a train in a station, you might be arrested and have your money taken. Then people got smart and started, catching the train before a couple of miles down the track, or past the station down the track. And of course, they had money because they worked hard on the land. Maybe they had sold their furniture. But they